Boker Tov, Haverim. Welcome, my friends, to our uh, Taste of Torah for this week. I want to begin by declaring that this week's Taste of Torah is sponsored by gefilte fish. Gefilte fish, because there are worse things in life. Uh, that actually alludes to the fact that for the first time in our Torah portion, we're going to be mentioning kashrut, but I want to focus on some other things first. First of all, a little bit of stylistic issues, and that is that I've been told that I tend to stare at the screen rather than at the camera. So I'm trying, I'm trying to bring my eyes up to the camera. My face is really so interesting. I'd much rather look at that, but I'm going to work on it and see if I can be a more effective communicator eye to eye. All right. So our Torah portion this week is called Mishpatim, a word that simply means rules, sentences, laws. In rabbinic tradition, mishpatim are particular kinds of laws. That is, laws that have a innate logic to them. One could imagine, even if they weren't commanded in the Torah, that any healthy society would adopt those rules. Those are called mishpatim. In the rabbinic parlance, other terms that we use, like chukim or ordinances, are assumed to apply to things like this, kashrut, laws that are binding but really kind of difficult to explain. They don't seem to have any innate logic to them or any clear, practical, human reasoning behind them. So, but the mishpatim, again, in rabbinic terms, means pragmatic laws, self-evident laws, things like that. That's not necessarily what's going on in our Torah portion. That's just the first word that appears in the portion. So, but it does clue us into what's happening, and what's happening is that we are going to get a list of laws. This is the Torah portion that follows immediately upon the Ten Commandments, and it just seems like a logical continuation to talk about more laws for society, laws for Jews as a religious group, and that's in fact what we get. We get a big chunk of laws. Now I'm going to draw attention to some of the big ideas that appear among our laws, but then I'm going to come back to the very idea of law itself. So the first thing that you'll notice is change is gradual, because one of the early issues that appears in our Torah portion is, how do we treat slaves? Now, for us, from the modern perspective, in societies that have long ago given up slavery, this seems to be a little mind-blowing, because were we not slaves in Egypt, and did God not set us free, and did that not set an example for us on how we should structure our society? And the answer is yes. However, the economics of the ancient world were such, in a moneyless society, in a society where labor was the primary expression of wealth for any individual, the practice of different forms of slavery continued, even despite the example given to us by the early parts of Exodus. So, two examples, and the ones that we deal with here primarily. We're not talking about chattel slavery, which is the slavery that was inflicted upon African slaves brought to the United States, to the Caribbean and South America, where they were essentially considered property to be worked to death. Rather, there are two kinds of slavery occurring in ancient Israel. There is the occasional war slave, prisoners that are captured and repurposed as servants for either warriors or the monarchy. But those are rare, and much more common is the indebted slave, what we would call in English law a indentured servant. And basically, the idea was that this individual had run up some form of debt that they could not repay other than by working it off. And so the laws that we encounter in our Torah portion are telling us about what are the rules and limitations of debt slavery. How long can you keep someone in debt slavery? What protections do they have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I say this because, again, I want to frame the idea that social change is a process. Eventually, we would emerge out of the economic practice of slavery, and it would be sensible and logical based on the Torah portion, but the economic logic of the ancient world made slavery a universal institution in various forms. I don't want to say any slavery is good, but relatively speaking, the kind of slavery described in the Torah is a fairly moderate form of it. All right, let's go on to something else. Another aspect of our Torah portion is the message that we should not seek revenge. One of the clear intentions of the book of Exodus is to create a higher system of justice and to get us to think about the people that we may have a grudge against or our enemies as not someone that we just need to lash out at. If there's really, really something they have done to us materially harmful, then we go to courts of law to deal with that. And we do not seek revenge. We even have the message that says that if you find your enemy struggling with a problem, that you should help him. So this is so counterintuitive to the human experience that it gets reinforced in various ways with various rules, mishpatim, and laws that are presented. The ancient, back to economics, the ancient system that we encounter in the Bible, it's not capitalism, it's not communism. None of these economic systems existed in the ancient world. It was a barter system. And it's really hard at times to draw true parallels between the economic conditions described in the Bible and the economic conditions we encounter today. We will encounter certain kinds of ethics, like you shall not withhold payment from a worker. You shall not unnecessarily seize essential properties from them as collateral to a loan, things like that. But really, you can't draw many parallels to the arguments we have today about complex economic systems. However, one of the things that is clearly honored and protected in the Hebrew Bible is property ownership. Property grants us certain protections. We are entitled to own property that is our own, and also places upon us certain responsibilities. We shouldn't leave our property neglected in such a way that it may potentially be a hazard to our fellow human beings, to our neighbors. So we see the most elementary aspects of property ownership addressed and property ownership respected. But again, I wouldn't go too far in trying to make parallels to our current experiences, our current controversies about how best to organize an economy. And then, of course, we come to the theme of caring for the stranger. Now, that has become very prominent in the past week because of the events that happened at Colleyville. A gunman got access past the security at Colleyville, the locked doors, because the rabbi at Colleyville in an act that is really 3,000 years old in Jewish tradition, extended care to a stranger. A man came to the door of the congregation on a very cold day. He asked to come in. The rabbi invited him in, gave him a cup of tea, told him they were about to conduct a service, and within a few minutes, he revealed himself to be a gunman and a hostage taker. Terrible, terrible, terrible. But what we all have to struggle with is the question of, do these very rare occasional events negate our 3,000-year-old obligation to be kind to the stranger, to give them legal protection, to honor them and not oppress them? The tradition of Haknasat Orchim, of welcoming a stranger into our midst, goes back to our ancestor Abraham. And we have to recall that just as the readers of the book of Genesis would have understood in the Iron Age, by taking in strangers that were not known to him, not members of his clan, Abraham was taking a risk. And historically, we have accepted that that's part of what it is to be a decent Jew and a decent person, is that you'll take a modicum of risk in order to ensure the security and the health and the well-being of people you don't even know. So while we struggle with what happened, I don't see us giving up the tradition of being a welcoming community, and I hope you don't either. All right, now let's just get to the matter of law itself, because I think this is worth thinking about. If you read this Torah portion, it's not a compelling read. There's really no narrative. It's just a list of laws, and therefore it seems pretty bereft as a literary document. But I would go on to say that even law has its own kind of literary structure. Good law is composed in a way that is comprehensible, even if it's not necessarily comprehensive. And that is certainly the case with these laws. They are not comprehensive. They do not explain themselves. They do not, as a general rule, detail how they are to be implemented. What we would call the rules and regs are not there. These are just mitzvot, commandments given by God, instructions in a legal format. Now, scholars have identified two kinds of laws in the Hebrew Bible. One is apodictic. That's a fancy word. Basically, it just means you shall not. A direct instruction, an absolute statement about what is permissible and what is not. Now, what isn't there, as I just alluded to, are the fine details. Are there limits to these rules? And what are the limits? And how do we make these commandments a reality? This has always been an issue, and it's an issue here. Not being self-explanatory, we have to enter into the conversation and figure out what is both the realistic intent of the law and how can we realistically, pragmatically implement it. How do we apply this in a real-world situation? We have this today with the Constitution. The Constitution makes certain kinds of absolute declarations in the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, but anyone who's familiar with the law knows that it doesn't begin and end there. That, in fact, in order to be able to make the First and Second Amendment practical for a living society that is looking for the good, we already start immediately imagining each of these kinds of not commandments, but rights, have limits to them. Can you say anything you want to under any circumstances in the First Amendment? No. Can you engage in any religious activity to the exclusion of government intervention? No. You can't sacrifice humans, even if your religion says you're supposed to, because government has a stake in how we treat each other. Same thing with the Second Amendment. Is the right to own any kind of firearm absolutely without limitation? And the answer is no. So there's a long history of that happening in American law, addressing what are the limits and what are the protections that come with an amendment. And the same thing is true, even more so, with Jewish law. All the apodictic laws that we encounter in our Torah portion this week have been analyzed and regulated and defined over a period of a couple thousand years by our sages. So we may read the commandments, they might provide us with a general guideline for what we're supposed to do and what we're not supposed to do. But when it comes down to the particulars, we need the rabbis, the sages, to help us make that a reality in our daily lives, like kosher food, right? Okay. Then there's a second literary form to laws, and that's called casuistic. And casuistic is often used as an insult. Criticism of Judaism as a religion is that we're casuistic. We're always trying to think of every single angle on something, and somehow that's ungodly or less than adequate. I won't get into that right now. So the term as it applies to the Hebrew Bible is simple. It simply means a law that is framed this way. If X, then Y. All right? If you see your enemy's animal collapsed under its burden, then you are obligated to help him get it back on its feet. All right? So these interesting laws are really also, I think, in modern tradition, I'm not a lawyer, but I think they're also called case law. They give you a specific example of a specific situation, and they give you a specific remedy as to what you are supposed to do in that situation. Now, these are so specific that it leads to the question, oh, well, what if there are variations on this case? What happens if the conditions are slightly different? Does it still apply, or do we have to apply it just to that particular situation? And this leads a lot of biblical scholars to think that all of the mitzvot, all of the various commandments that God gave us, which by tradition we define as 613, are not actually meant to be practical law. They are, the fancy term again is heuristic, meaning that they are supposed to set examples for us and how we should think and how we should organize our society, but it isn't that we're necessarily going to appeal to mitzvah 347 in the code of Jewish law in order to apply it. So, and I think there's some reason for thinking that, even though the rabbis spend a great deal of time trying to make the 613 commandments function for an essential Jewish society, the result of that is the Talmud. And the Talmud is a document that is over 60 tractates in size. It's bigger than the Encyclopedia Judaica. It looks, in fact, like a shelf full of American or British law books, because so many things require some kind of governance and some kind of law in life. And the commandments, the mere 613, it's hardly any at all, really don't provide us with an adequate scope of everything we need in order to form a society. Um, remember, in current society, we have criminal law, we have civil law, we have zoning and property law, we have traffic laws. I could go on and on and on about the different kinds of laws that we live by, that we absorb into our everyday life, and that we simply conduct ourselves by them. In many cases, if you sat down and tried to think of all the laws you obey on a day-to-day basis, the number would go into the thousands. So it seems self-evident that the Torah and its commandments are not meant to represent the full scope of what a legal system should be or could be. So they're heuristic. They're examples meant to help us on our way as we come up with our own standards and our own laws and our own way of living. I think that the medieval philosopher Bachya Ibn Pakuda knew that when he wrote his book called Chavot Levivot, which means duties of the heart. And in it, he starts to talk about all the things that a decent person is required to do that go well beyond the 613 commandments. So when we look at these commandments, we shouldn't necessarily feel that we are absolutely bound to them. They really are, for lack of a better term in modern parlance, a kind of guideline. That applies to things like kashrut. We have made a very elaborate system of kashrut with a lot of rules that we say are all derived from the Torah. But in fact, kashrut rules in the Torah are guidelines, and that's why Reform Judaism treats them as such. Maybe in a future session, I will talk at length about kashrut and can it apply to us? Should it apply to us? What's our relationship with kashrut as modern Jews? But I'm going to leave it at my simple lesson on the literary nature of Israelite law, of biblical law. It really is remarkable in and of itself. It's worth reading, and oftentimes it is a compelling read, even though we have a hard time imagining that. Trust me, it's really interesting. So I'm going to stop there, and that's our Torah portion for this week, Mishpatim. We will encounter many more commandments in the weeks and months ahead, and I'll come back to this theme so that we can develop our sense of relationship to Jewish law in a deeper and more understanding way. Until then, lehitraot. We'll see you again soon.